Hello, my dears. I hope you had a wonderful day today. Are you ready to listen to another story? Today, it will be even more exciting. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you help us develop, and write your impressions of this story in the comments. Well, let's get started. Rain had a way of writing over everything in Gloomhaven. It softened brick, rounded voices, and carried the smell of salt and wet pine through every street until the whole town breathed in the same slow rhythm. Patter, hush, patter, hush. On this particular night, the rain wrote its long cursive across the harbor roofs, while distant lightning scratched pale signatures in the clouds. Thunder took its time, never sudden, always a patient drum somewhere beyond the hills, just enough to remind you the sea was a heartbeat, and the sky was listening. Mara arrived after last ferry, her suitcase dark with damp at the edges, the wheels hissing on the slick pier boards. The harbor lamps held halos in the drizzle, and the lighthouse above the town wore its steady crown, a revolving eye that blinked through sheets of water as if to say, "You found your way back after all." Every few steps, she tested her breath against the wind, still briny, still cold, still home. She hadn't planned to return. Cities had been her vow, skylines her defiance. For years, she lived in tall buildings with dry elevators and crisp central heating. But the envelope had come one afternoon when a summer thunderstorm marched over the glass towers like a dark army. Mara had watched the rain draw ghosts down the windows, and then saw her name inked in a familiar hand on the envelope with a Gloomhaven postmark, and a smear where a raindrop must have fallen before it ever left the town. Inside, a single faded photograph. Two teenagers under a striped umbrella, a crooked night market closing sign behind them, the umbrella tilted so that one shoulder soaked and the other stayed dry. Hers soaked, his dry, both laughing like stormlight. Rowan had written nothing on the back. He never had to. The memory rode the rain back to her without words. Now, years later, she rolled her suitcase toward the inn at the foot of Lantern Street, past rain-fat hydrangeas bowing over the fence, and the bookshop that always smelled like paper and tide flats. The bell above the inn door chimed and stuck, damp metal complaining, and Mrs. Ellery looked up from her ledger with a face like an open door. "You timed it with the weather, dear," she said. "Best time to arrive. The thunder brings people home." Mara smiled, the old phrase rising to meet her like a step she'd forgotten was there. "Does it ever stop?" Mrs. Ellery tilted her head toward the window, where the downpour made a moth-wing blur of the world, not in ways that matter. The room was as she remembered from childhood stays: two lamps, a quilt the color of storm clouds, the window that faced the harbor. Even the window latch felt the same, stubborn first, then a yielding click, as though the room had been waiting and wanted to make her earn entry. She set her suitcase down and pushed the window open just enough to let the rain sound in. Cool air slid its thin fingers over her face. She could hear how the weather layered itself. Roof drumming from the inn, whisper of gutters, beat and run along the sash, the far hiss of rain on the sea. Beneath it, thunder rolled like someone turning over in sleep. She lay on the bed not to rest, but to listen. And in that listening, the past arranged itself without her permission. Rowan, steadily kind, the sort of boy who learned the names of storms because it seemed polite to address them properly. He'd worked summers at the lighthouse, weather station, measuring wind and recording barometric pressure in a pencil logbook. The paper always slightly wrinkled from damp, his handwriting straight as fence pickets. He'd taught her the old mariner's rhyme, red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky at morning, sailors take warning. But in Gloamhaven, the sky was usually a drowned pewter, and they'd laughed and called themselves exception keepers. The night of the photograph, the night market at the harbor, had been thinning under a downpour that began like a rumor and ended like an anthem. They'd shared an umbrella borrowed from a fishmonger, its stripes running as colors bled. "Half of us will be baptized," Rowan had said, angling the umbrella so her shoulder soaked. "A ceremony," she'd replied, tipping the umbrella back toward him until they both dripped. They made a pact, quick as rain, careful as vows, not to leave town without telling the other. They kept it as long as children can keep any sacred thing. When fate tested it later, there were no villains, just two people trying to figure out which life was weather and which was climate. A car hissed by on Lantern Street, its tires slicing the puddles. The inn settled around her, wood faintly creaking the way ships do. Mara sat up and traced a finger along the window glass, drawing a line and watching the rain erase it. She took the photograph from her pocket and set it on the bedside table. The smiles had never faded. Water had left a faint bloom at one corner, like a pale flower pressed there intentionally. "Back then, where did you think this would end?" she asked the faces. The boy's grin offered no answer. The girl's eyes seemed to be reading weather far ahead. She couldn't delay the obvious. She rebuttoned her coat, slid the photo back into her pocket, and stepped into the corridor where old carpet drank her footsteps. Outside, the rain felt firmer, as if it had been lifting weights in her absence. Lightning stitched the horizon, quick, delicate needlework, followed by thunder that rolled down the hill and through her bones. The lighthouse beam swept once, twice, placing a pale coin of light on the harbor with each revolution. Rowan would be at the weather station if he was anywhere. The lighthouse road curved up behind the bookshop, where a chalkboard sign sagged under drops. "Storm sail, books that love rain." The shop window glowed, fogged by kettle steam and human conversation. Inside, a girl with a sea glass earring read aloud to a boy in a yellow slicker. Next door, a cafe called Downpour pulled its signboard inside and replaced it with a handwritten note. "Closed early, lightning likes company." Mara climbed the hill, rain ticking against the hood of her coat. At the switchback, she paused to look down. Gloamhaven shone in 1,000 modest ways, light leaking warm from windows, running along gutters, pooling in doorways where neighbors spoke with umbrellas, touching like shy hands. The storm was not an enemy here. It was the parish bell, the town crier, the faithful background to every small miracle. A baby soothed, a quarrel softened, a kettle whistling. The lighthouse steps were wet and moss soft. She held the rail and took her time. At the top, the low building that housed the weather station huddled against the lighthouse base, its roof glistening. Inside, she found the door unlatched and the room warm from a small heater. The rain's voice came through the vents. Instruments ticked and hummed little lives. A coffee mug sat on the table, ringed with a fresh crescent stain. "Hello," she called. The room answered with thunder. Mara crossed to the logbook and opened it, the paper still slightly wavy. The day's entries were crisp. Wind NE 14 knots, barometer falling. Lightning southwest frequency increasing. The handwriting was the same as it had always been, steady, unfussy. And even reading, it felt like standing under an umbrella with someone. She ran her finger under the last line, and then stopped where a note had been tucked between pages. Went to check the lower path. Back soon. R, she smiled at the initial. He was somewhere in the rain then, where he belonged. The lower path was the one that skirted the bluff and cut down to the sea cave where, when they were 16, they'd hidden treasures of no value. A bottle of rainwater they'd sworn was from the exact minute of their first kiss. A smooth stone shaped like a heart, but chipped at the top. A ticket stub from a town play where thunder had drowned out a crucial line. And they'd never known how the second act truly ended. The cave had a habit of becoming what people needed it to be: sanctuary, echo chamber, diary, without pages. She followed the path, careful where the rain had slicked it. The storm talked around her, the intimate talk it reserved for those who kept walking instead of running indoors. Lightning flared again. Thunder followed more quickly now, like a friend drawing closer. As the path dropped, the surf roared, its white edges flashing in the brief light. The cave mouth appeared as a darker darkness in the cliff. "Rowan," she called over the rain. The cave, generous as ever, returned his name to her in fragments. Something moved within, a figure stepping from shadow, a yellow hood vivid even in the storm-gray night. When he pushed the hood back, the years arranged themselves somewhere invisible but real, the way rain organizes along a window, and then suddenly moves as one. His face was older in ways that suited it, lines at the corners of his eyes, a steadier set to his mouth. But it was still Rowan, the boy who had catalogued storms as if the sky were a library, and he possessed the only card. He smiled, and lightning framed the moment like an overzealous photographer. "Mara," he said, not as a question. "Your letter didn't have words," she replied, water threading her hair to her cheeks, "but I read it anyway." He glanced toward the sea, then back. I thought the photograph would say what I couldn't. It did, she said. It said rain remembers. They stood for a small span of heartbeats, listening to the cave drip. The waves strike and withdraw. The storm hold its breath in the pause between thunder and rain's resumed applause. Then Rowan gestured toward the cave interior. I checked the lower path because the tide's running high with this system. The cave sometimes takes a notion to flood, and I didn't want it surprising anyone. A quick grin. You always hated surprises. Only the kind without umbrellas, she said. They stepped into the cave's shelter, where the rain became a gray curtain at the entrance. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of stone and salt. Their footsteps made a soft, hollow sound, like tapping on a book's spine. He turned his headlamp on low, and the beam found the small shelf where they'd once kept their treasures. The bottle was gone, of course it was, but the stone remained, its chipped heart still honest, and the ticket stub, laminated long ago with tape, sat under it like a promise that had not resigned, even when nobody checked on it. Rowan touched the stone with a forefinger lightly. I didn't think this would survive. We left it where the rain could find it, Mara said. Things last longer like that. He nodded, considering not just her words, but the way the storm went about its patient work. Thunder boomed again, rolled through the cave, softened at the edges by stone. The headlamp caught her face. She looked away, then back, meeting his eyes fully. You knew I'd come, she said simply. I hoped, he answered. Hope is a kind of weather, isn't it? Not the dramatic kind. It just holds. Outside, the rain thickened. Each drop a firm tap on the earth, a steadying hand on the shoulder. The cave mouth blurred as water wove itself into a curtain. Lightning turned the falling sheet into a silver veil, thunder stitched a seam. I left because I wanted a life that didn't depend on forecasts, Mara said, voice low. I thought dryness meant certainty. And I learned that dry places have their own storms. They're just quieter until they aren't. I kept waiting for the air to tell me the truth the way it does here. Rowan breathed in, breathed out, his chest rising and falling in a tempo that seemed synced to the rain beyond the cave. I stayed because I don't mind checking the sky every hour. I like being in conversation with it. I like that it answers, even when it says no. Especially then, he said. At least it's honest. She laughed softly, a sound the cave approved of, returning it to her a fraction warmer. Another lightning flash whitened the rain. Thunder rolled in quick behind it. Close now, the heart of the storm was crossing the harbor and ascending the hill, house by house, lamp by lamp. Will the town flood? She asked, practical, grounding herself in this ritual of shared care. Not tonight, he said, checking instinctively toward the path, the tide. We'll get the river high by morning, but the estuary will handle it. We'll sandbag the corner by the grocer, because it pretends it's a boat some storms, but people know what to do. We've rehearsed this 1,000 rainy nights. Mara turned the chipped heartstone in her hand, felt its cool weight. We rehearsed something else, she said. He watched the stone as though it were a compass. "We did," he agreed. "And when we finally perform it," she said, "maybe it doesn't need to be the grand opening night. Maybe it can be the quiet midweek show the rain always attends." He smiled, something uncoiling between them, not tension, not distance, but the cord of years notched with weather marks. The rain drummed louder for a moment, as if to approve. They stood in the cave's mouth until the storm's center passed overhead. Thunder cracking like an old log splitting, then loosening into its rolling purr. Lightning, less insistent now, flickered like the last applause. The rain steadied into its endless lullaby. Outside, the lighthouse beam turned and turned, placing its patient coin of light again and again on the wet face of the harbor. "Come back to the station," Rowan said. "We can watch the tail of it from the tower. The glass fogs in a way I think you'll remember." "And afterward?" she asked, because the dry city had taught her to ask for afters, for tomorrows, for the shape of a plan beyond weather maps. "We'll walk Lantern Street," he said. "We'll check the grocer's corner. We'll say hello to Mrs. Ellery, who will pretend she knew all along. We'll pick up tea from Downpour when they open again, because they always put extra ginger in on storm nights." And then he hesitated, not from fear but care. "And then we can talk about what forecast we're willing to live inside. Not certainty, but a pattern you and I choose together." Mara slipped the photograph from her pocket and propped it against the stone on the shelf, as if, after years in drawers and wallets, it deserved a view. The two teenagers under the failing umbrella looked out at rain. They were too young to understand, and loved anyway. "Let's go watch the tail," she said. They walked the path back up, careful, the rain softening now from percussion to brush strokes. The town exhaled, gutters muttering, roofs shedding. Windows brightened as people returned to their books, and soup pots and chessboards. Thunder settled into the distance like a great animal finding sleep. At the top, the weather station's door welcomed them with that familiar stick then give. They climbed the narrow stairs to the lighthouse glass, where the world unfolded in rings of wet light. The beams slid over the harbor and threw their reflections across the room in pale silhouettes. For a while, they said nothing. You don't talk over a rain's last song. When Mara finally spoke, it was against the glass, words fogging and fading as quickly as they were made. "I didn't come for closure," she said. "I came to see if the door was still open." Rowan's reflection nodded once, not dramatic. "It never stuck," he said. "It just swelled a little in the damp." They laughed quietly at the rightness of that. The rain, satisfied with its work, eased to a fine silver fall. And in Gloamhaven, a town that never quite dried, the night carried them toward morning with its familiar orchestra, the soft footstep of drops along eaves, the restless turning of the sea, the occasional distant voice saying goodbye to thunder and hello to rest. Beneath all of it, something steady returned, not lightning bright, not headline loud, but as lasting as water working stone. Two people, telling each other the forecast they wanted to believe in. While the rain kept time against the glass, they stood in the glass crown of the lighthouse until the storm's tail thinned into a silvery gauze. The beam kept sweeping calm, relentless, laying a coin of light over roofs beaded with water. Each time the lantern turned, their reflections passed over the glass, pale figures behind a curtain of rain, here and gone. "The tale's my favorite part," Rowan said. "Not the drama, not the first crack, just this steady fall after the sky's done shouting." Mara watched the harbor breathe masts nodding in the drip, mooring ropes sucking and releasing against cleats. Gulls tucked on pilings like folded paper. "It sounds like forgiveness," she said, and the glass fogged a little where her breath met it. They left the lantern room and descended the narrow stair, hand on the rail made slick by years of sea salt hands. In the station, Rowan shrugged into a dry sweater from a hook and handed Mara a faded blue knit that had belonged to the weather station since before either of them. She pulled it on. It smelled like wool and storm maps. "Grocer's Corner?" he asked. "Grocer's Corner," she agreed. Outside, the rain had settled into its lullaby. Streetlights spilled warm ovals on the wet road, and the sound of water was everywhere, dripping from eaves, clicking from leaves, whispering along gutters. Thunder had already walked out over the open water, grumbling to itself. Lightning, tired now, only pulsed faintly inside the cloud bank, like a night light in a distant room. They followed the path down through the hydrangeas and past the bookshop, where the chalkboard had been wiped and rewritten in spite of the weather. "Open at dawn. Damp pages, warm tea." At the grocer's, the door was propped, and a little line had formed inside, neighbors in raincoats, trading storm notes the way other towns traded headlines. Rowan called Mr. Harrow from behind a pyramid of green apples that glistened like they'd been lacquered by the storm. "You're just in time. The corner's thinking it's a canoe again." "On it," Rowan said. He grabbed the stack of sandbags, stenciled with the town crest, a simple lighthouse under rain, and passed them out the door to Mara. Together, they built the small wall they'd built 100 times as teenagers, their hands remembering the rhythm. Lift, set, pat, lift, set, pat. The rain applauded, not loudly now, but with a steady patience that seemed to say, "You know how to do this." "Back for good?" Mr. Harrow asked Mara, as he adjusted the sign that always fell crooked after storms. "For now," she said, and left it at that. The rain was good at holding unfinished thoughts without judging them. When they were done, Rowan pressed the last bag into place and straightened. "That should keep your apples from learning to swim." Mr. Harrow saluted with a roll of paper towels. "My hero. And Mara, if you're staying at Mrs. Ellery's, I'll send over a sack of lemons. She makes a storm cake with them." "Still does," Mara said, surprised by how easily the town's old phrases returned. They stepped back into the street. "Tea?" Rowan asked, nodding toward Downpour. The cafe's windows glowed, and someone had scrawled "reopened" for tail watchers. on the fogged glass. Inside was warm and full of rain-warmed voices. The place always smelled like cardamom, ginger, and wet coats. A string of small paper lanterns hung along the ceiling, each painted with a simple raindrop. All the tables were taken, except the one in the corner under the shelf of board games. No one ever finished, because conversation insisted on winning. "Kettle's been waiting," called Nor from behind the counter. Her braid was damp at the ends, and she wore the cafe's unofficial uniform: dark sweater, brighter smile. "Ginger extra tonight," the storm demanded it. "We obey," Rowan said. "Two." They took the corner table, steam lifting from cups, windows humming with rain. The thunderless quiet was the kind that makes people breathe easier. A child at a nearby table pressed his nose to the glass to watch rivulets race. His mother bet on the left stream, the child on the right. And their laughter rose when the underdog won near the frame. "Why the photograph and not a letter?" Mara asked, turning the cup between her hands to warm them. Outside, a flash far off stitched the horizon, and the cafe seemed to lean toward it as one. Rowan rested his arms on the table, fingers laced the way he had when he used to talk about pressure systems, purposeful, not dramatic. Words felt like a map, with all the roads smudged. The picture was one clean road back. "And it worked," she said. The sweater warmed around her shoulders. "But also, why now?" He glanced at the paper lanterns and then at her, as if to ask permission of both. "Two reasons. My dad finally sold the old skiff. Said he didn't need it anymore. To everyone else, that was just a sale. To me, it was the last door of his life closing with a proper latch." Rowan smiled, but it carried the small ache of endings. "He's fine, fitter than me, probably. It just made time feel measured. And the second reason," he looked past her to the glass and its ever-changing script of water. "The rain lantern walk is in a week." Mara blinked, a lift of surprise that was mostly memory. The rain lantern walk, the town's quiet ritual every year after the first big summer storm that refused to stop. People would gather at dusk with small lanterns, umbrellas touching, and walk the harbor path from the lighthouse down to the sea cave and back, leaving the lanterns along the way to turn the rain into a string of patient stars. When they were 16, she and Rowan had promised to walk it together every year. They managed 3. The 4th year, she was in a dorm under a dry sky, misjudging distance. The 5th, they were careful with their words and told each other they were being kind. After that, promises became whether you referred to without stepping outside. "I didn't know," she said. "I figured," he replied gently, "but I wanted to ask with enough time. If you want to walk, walk with me." Nor set a plate of lemon slices between them. "On the house," she said. "It's a lantern week. You two look like lantern people." Mara smiled. "We'll try to be worthy." When Nor moved on, Rowan lifted one slice and squeezed it into his tea. "There's no pressure," he said. "Walking with the town is just walking. It doesn't promise anything. It just admits you're here. Mara looked at the window, where the rain had started whispering at a slightly different angle, the way it does when a subtle wind change writes a new line across the street. In the city, I thought showing up had to be louder, she said. I forgot how to do the quiet version. Quiet holds, he said. It lasts. She took a sip. The ginger burned in a good way. The lemon lifted it. A bolt of memory cut across her thoughts. The first time they'd walked the lantern path together. Rowan naming clouds, as if introducing friends. Her umbrella catching his. The small electric shock of hands brushing in the rain. It wasn't the headline thunder, not even the flash. It was the afterglow. Rowan, she said, because the city had taught her not to trust anyone else to draw the boundary of honesty for her. There's something you should know. In 10 days, I'm supposed to say yes to a promotion. It would mean another move. Drier, bigger, more of everything I thought I wanted. She set the cup down so quietly it didn't even clink. I came here telling myself I needed to think, that I needed to see if my compass worked. I didn't come to make a scene at a cafe table. Not a scene, he said. Just weather. He thought a moment. I'm not asking for a decision tonight, or at the walk. I only asked about walking. The rest is the climate of your life, not this one storm. She laughed under her breath. You always talk like this. I don't know how else to be, he admitted, with a tilt of humility she'd always liked. But if you want a sentence without clouds in it, I'm glad you're here. That was simple and heavy, and came down like rain on a roof. She nodded, because saying thank you would have broken something that didn't need breaking. They finished their tea and stepped back into the hush. The rain had taken on that quilted quality, soft but present, a sound between pages. Lantern Street glowed like a string of pearls someone forgot to put away. Mrs. Ellery stood in the inn doorway with a towel and the kind of smile that made people tell the truth without meaning to. You sandbagged Mr. Harrow again, she said as they approached. Tradition, Rowan said. Mrs. Ellery's gaze slid to Mara. I put your storm cake on the dresser. Slice before bed keeps the thunder polite. I thought thunder left town, Mara said. Polite, rude, either way, cake helps, Mrs. Ellery replied, and the lantern walks posted for Saturday at dusk. If anyone asks, yes, we go even if it's raining. Especially then. Especially, Rowan said. Good night, dears. She retreated, the bell above the door making its damp, stubborn complaint. On the inn steps, rain threaded their hair again. Mara touched her pocket for the photograph and found it gone. Then she remembered. She'd propped it in the cave, letting the older version of themselves keep watch over the tide. The thought felt right, like aligning a picture on a wall by feel instead of measuring. Do you still keep the logbook neat when there's lightning? She asked. A sudden image of their teenage arguments, her wanting to draw the strikes like jagged stars. Him insisting on tidy tally marks, making her smile. Worse, he said. They finally let me buy a second book just for lightning. The tidy one gets jealous. "Take me tomorrow," she said. "I want to see what jealousy looks like in pencil." "Deal." They stood there a moment longer, letting the rain's soft insistence do the talking. A cat padded across the street, like a shadow, deciding to try being an animal. Someone upstairs closed a window. Somewhere else, a radio murmured a song that sounded like it had been recorded in a room with a tin roof. "Lanterns in a week," Rowan said, as if setting a small stone on a shelf where it would be safe. "In a week," she echoed, and tested the shape of the agreement in her mouth. It fit. He touched her elbow, brief, careful. The way you touch a door you hope is unlocked. "Good night, Mara. Good night." In her room, she ate 2 bites of Mrs. Ellery's storm cake and set the rest aside for morning. She cracked the window to let in more of the rain's hush. Lightning blinked gently somewhere out over the black ribbon of the sea, and thunder answered like a sleepy friend. She lay back and listened as Gloomhaven settled around her, footfalls below, a pipe ticking as it cooled, rain writing its endless letter to whoever would listen. On the dresser beside her keys, she placed a small note to herself. Nothing grand, nothing binding, just a word she hadn't written in months, because dry places don't leave room for it. "Maybe," she wrote, and underlined it once. Down at the harbor, the tide turned. In the cave, the chipped heartstone held its place. On the lighthouse hill, 2 logbooks waited, one tidy, one full of lightning. The rain kept time. The morning opened with rain, as always. It was softer now, like a long whisper across the roofs, a curtain that never lifted, but learned to move gently. The harbor glistened under a pale sky stitched with gray threads, and the lighthouse beam made its sleepy rounds, as though the night hadn't yet been convinced to end. Mara woke to the sound of the gutter outside her window, emptying itself in intervals. 3 beats of water, pause, then 3 again. It reminded her of a metronome. The storm cake crumbs on her plate were gone, stolen by the rain's invisible fingers in the night. Or maybe she had finished them, half asleep. Either way, sweetness lingered at the edge of memory. Downstairs, Mrs. Ellery was already polishing the ledger with a cloth that squeaked in protest. "You slept through the dawn thunder," she said. "A good sign. People who can sleep through the dawn thunder belong here." Mara smiled faintly and stepped outside, the borrowed sweater still warm against her skin. Lantern Street smelled of wet earth, lemon rind from last night's tea, and the faint smoke of someone's damp chimney. Rowan was waiting at the corner, hair plastered to his forehead, holding a notebook in one hand and a crooked umbrella in the other. "Ready for jealousy?" he asked, lifting the notebook slightly. "The jealous logbook," she said, amused. "I'm ready." They climbed the lighthouse road. Rain ticked off the hood of her coat, steady as a clock. At the station, the air smelled of pencil shavings, wool, and damp paper. Rowan set the umbrella to drip by the door and brought out 2 logbooks from the shelf. One was straight and tidy rows of numbers, careful handwriting, dates underlined. The other was chaos, lightning sketches, jagged streaks, spirals, even one page where drops had smudged pencil into a silver-gray blur. "This one throws tantrums," Rowan said, tapping the messy log. "I let it. Weather shouldn't always behave." Mara traced a fingertip across one wild page where arcs of light had been drawn like restless veins. "It looks alive." "It is," he said softly. "Sometimes I think storms keep a diary in us. We're just scribes copying it down." She looked up at him, startled by how much she had missed hearing words like that spoken aloud, not just thought in silence. A gust rattled the shutters. Rain slanted suddenly, hammering the glass for a few minutes before returning to its usual rhythm. The storm was still alive, still restless. Rowan set 2 mugs on the table. Steam lifted. Today's forecast is more of the same. "Isn't it always?" Mara asked. "Always," he said. "But always doesn't mean nothing. It means the story keeps being written." They sat at the weather station table, rain playing its endless song overhead, and turned the logbook pages together, every tally mark of thunder, every line of lightning, every smudge of rainwater. They were not just records of storms. They were maps of time, proof of a life lived in rhythm with the sky, and for the first time in years, Mara felt her own life shift back into that rhythm, as if a metronome had been set down inside her chest and was finally beating in tune with the rain outside. The rain thickened by afternoon, falling in long, unbroken strands like silver threads unraveling from the sky. Lantern Street disappeared behind a misty veil, and the harbor blurred until masts looked like pencil sketches drawn on wet paper. Somewhere beyond the clouds, the sun existed, but Gloomhaven hadn't seen it in weeks. Here, light belonged to reflections, not sources. Mara stood by the window of the weather station, watching the drops crawl down the glass like hesitant travelers, their paths splitting and merging in quiet negotiation. Behind her, Rowan bent over a map spread across the table, marking small red circles where the coastline had been losing ground year after year. "Do you ever get used to it?" she asked, eyes still on the rain. "To what?" Rowan replied without looking up. "To the idea that everything here is temporary. Shorelines, streets, even the cliffs." He set the pencil down and straightened. "You stop fighting it," he said. "The rain teaches you that nothing holds forever. But if you're lucky, you learn what can last anyway." Mara turned to face him. "And what lasts?" Rowan smiled faintly, as if the answer wasn't meant to be spoken out loud. Instead, he gestured to the chipped, heart-shaped stone on the shelf, rescued years ago, and still exactly where they'd left it. "Some things," he said softly, "find their way back." They left the station together and followed the narrow path winding down toward the cliffs. The sea was restless today, its gray surface ruffled by wind, white foam tearing against rocks. Lightning forked faintly in the far distance, followed by thunder that reached them seconds later, deep and patient. The lower path curved along the bluff, leading toward the hidden cave they'd rediscovered the night before. Mara slowed when she saw it again. The same mouth of stone, the same dark hollow breathing salt air into the rain. Inside, the tide whispered softly against the walls, and droplets fell from the ceiling into shallow pools, making tiny rings on the surface. The lanterns from last year's rain walk still stood in the sand, their paper shells collapsed and soggy, but somehow untouched, as though even the sea had chosen to leave them alone. "It's smaller than I remembered," Mara said, kneeling near the shelf where their old treasures had once rested. "You grew," Rowan said simply. "Places don't shrink. We just see more of the world." She traced the edge of the shelf with her fingertips and smiled when she found the carved initials still faintly there. 2 letters, side by side, softened by years of moisture. "You never came back here alone?" she asked. "I came," he admitted, "but never for long. Some places are meant to hold memories, not new ones." Outside the cave, the rain deepened, heavier now, soaking into stone and earth alike. The sky had begun to bruise, clouds darkening into shades of slate and iron. Lantern Street was far below, lights glowing faintly through the storm. Rowan lifted his hood and glanced at her. "There's something I should show you," he said. "Where?" "The old pier," he replied, "before the tide swallows it again." They followed the cliff path back toward the harbor, the smell of wet salt and pine sharp in the air. The pier appeared through the mist like the ghost of an old memory, its planks warped, some missing entirely, the sea rising to reclaim it piece by piece. Rowan knelt near one of the pylons and brushed away the moss, revealing something carved deep into the wood, a date. It was from the year they'd made their pact to never leave without telling each other. "I came here the day you left," Rowan said, his voice low but steady. "I stood right here until the ferry disappeared into the fog. I thought if I waited long enough, the tide would bring you back." Mara swallowed, the sound lost under the constant rain. "I should have written," she said. "I told myself I was sparing us both, but maybe I was just hiding." Rowan stood and wiped his hands against his damp coat. "You don't owe me explanations," he said, "but I think we both deserve the chance to walk the lanterns together again. No expectations. Just this time, we finish the path." Lightning cracked somewhere beyond the horizon, illuminating his face for a brief, blinding second, and Mara felt the weight of his words settle between them like a promise waiting to be made. She nodded slowly. "Then, let's finish it." The rain fell harder, drumming against the hollow boards of the pier, and somewhere deep inside the storm, the sea carried their unspoken agreement away, tucking it into the gray folds of the horizon. By midweek, the entire town was talking about the rain lantern walk. Gloomhaven had few celebrations, but this one felt older than its streets, older even than the lighthouse. Every year after the first great summer storm, when the rain still lingered, but the thunder began to drift away, the townsfolk gathered at dusk with small paper lanterns. They walked the winding path from Lantern Street to the the sea cave and back, leaving glowing points of light along the way, as if stitching the town to the ocean with threads of fire. This year, the storm hadn't fully passed. The drizzle had softened, but never stopped, and gray clouds hung low enough to feel like you could touch them. The air smelled of salt, wet pine, and the faint tang of lightning too distant to see. Mara sat at the window of her room in Mrs. Ellery's inn, brushing drops of condensation from the glass with her fingertips. Below, Lantern Street was alive with quiet industry. Children darted between doorways carrying lantern frames, their laughter muffled by the drizzle. Shopkeepers hung strings of lights under their awnings despite the rain, and even the puddles reflected soft, patient colors. Her door creaked, and Mrs. Ellery appeared, holding a neatly folded cloak and a small box tied with twine. "Your lantern," she said. "Picked the paper myself. Best to have it dry before you go." Mara untied the box and opened it carefully. Inside was a fragile sphere of rice paper, pale as moonlight, with delicate painted raindrops cascading along its surface. Tiny glass beads were strung around the frame to catch whatever light would fall through the mist. "It's beautiful," Mara whispered. "Made by Nor's grandmother," Mrs. Ellery said, setting the cloak on the bed. "She paints the rain like no one else. They say each lantern carries the wishes you breathe into it. Careful what you hope for, dear." Mara traced the painted droplets with her fingertips, feeling their faint texture. "What do you usually wish for?" Mrs. Ellery smiled softly. "I don't wish anymore. I watch. Wishes are for the young. Watching is for the wise." Later that afternoon, Mara met Rowan at the weather station. He was perched on the low stone wall outside, lantern in his lap, its frame unfinished, damp curls sticking to his forehead. "You're late," he said, pretending to scowl. "You're still tying the frame," she countered, glancing at his hands. He grinned and held up a length of silk cord. "Perfection takes time. Besides, I've got a reputation to uphold. Can't have my lantern collapsing halfway down the bluff." She sat beside him on the stone wall. The air was cool and damp, and the scent of rain-soaked moss rose from the earth around them. "You know," she said, watching him knot the cord with practiced fingers, "I don't remember the last time we walked the lantern path together." 7 years, he said without hesitation. "Lantern walk of 18. You wore a green coat that leaked at the seams. We spent half the night fixing it with driftwood twine." Mara laughed softly, surprised he remembered so clearly. "You still keep all that in your head. Storms, tides, lantern walks," he said. "I keep what matters." As dusk approached, the town gathered at the harbor's edge, where the path began. Dozens of small lanterns hung from curved bamboo poles, their paper skins glowing like captured stars. The drizzle softened further, as if even the rain understood the ritual's weight. Nor stood by the cafe steps, handing out tea laced with ginger and honey to anyone with cold hands. Children darted between the crowd with damp ribbons in their hair, their cheeks flushed with anticipation. "Listen," Rowan said quietly, as they joined the gathering. The entire town had fallen silent. You could hear the sea breathing, the gulls settling, the distant hush of waves folding against rocks. Then, softly, the lighthouse bell chimed once, a low, resonant sound that rolled through the mist like a heartbeat. It was the signal. Lanterns were lit one by one, their pale flames trembling in the damp air. The glow spread gradually across the crowd, warm and steady, until the harbor looked like a necklace of small suns strung along the edge of the night. Mara's lantern came alive in her hands, its painted raindrops shining like beads of glass. She held it close for a moment, whispered a wish she couldn't quite name, and let Rowan lower the bamboo pole to secure it. The walk began. The path wound gently up the bluff, wet earth soft underfoot, puddles gleaming like mirrors in the faint light. Behind them, the town's lanterns reflected in the harbor, a constellation trapped on the water's surface. Ahead, the cliffside curved into shadow, the sea roaring softly below. "Feels different," Mara murmured as they climbed. Rowan glanced at her. "It is different," he said. "This time you're here." Lightning stitched a pale line through distant clouds, and thunder followed softly, like a thought too big to speak aloud. For a while, neither of them said anything. The path was lined with lanterns from previous years, their frames long collapsed. Paper melted into the earth, glass beads scattered like forgotten stars. Time layered itself here, without erasing anything completely. Every storm, every wish, every step still present, if you knew how to see it. At the highest point of the bluff, where the path turned toward the cave, Rowan stopped and raised his lantern. "Look, from here," Gloamhaven stretched below them in perfect miniature, the streets glowing, the windows lit, and the entire harbor cradled in the soft arms of rain and mist. The lighthouse beam swept once, twice, and for a moment, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. "This," Rowan whispered, "is why I stayed." Mara's throat tightened, and she nodded, unable to speak. Somewhere far below, the tide surged against the rocks, endless, patient, and unafraid of time. The path ahead led toward the cave, toward their old memories, toward a future neither of them had named yet. And above all of it, the rain kept falling, steady and eternal, as though it had been waiting years for this moment to arrive. The lantern path wound downward, slick with mist, leading the town toward the sea cave that had waited through every storm, every season, like a faithful witness. Lanterns swayed in the drizzle, their fragile light trembling, but never going out, casting gold ripples on wet stone and faces alike. Children ran ahead, their laughter echoing off the cliffs, while the elders walked slowly, each step deliberate, as if their lanterns carried not just flame, but memory. The rain softened, falling in delicate strands that clung to hair and lashes, so fine it seemed more like breath than water. Mara and Rowan walked side by side. Neither spoke. Words felt too heavy here, where silence was alive with thunder's ghost. and the hush of waves folding into the cave mouth. Inside, the cave shimmered with 100 small lights. Lanterns had been placed along the walls, in niches of stone, and even floated on shallow pools where water collected. The ceiling dripped in rhythm, a quiet percussion that blended with the sea's endless sigh. Mara paused at the shelf where their old treasures had rested. The chipped heartstone was still there, gleaming faintly in the lantern glow. Someone, a stranger or perhaps fate itself, had propped their old photograph beside it. The paper was damp, the edges curling, but the image remained. 2 teenagers laughing under a broken umbrella, baptized by rain. Her breath caught. "Rowan, I left it here. I came back after you," he admitted. "When you went to the inn, I thought it belonged with the others." She touched the photo gently, the damp surface fragile beneath her fingertips. The past and present blurred until she couldn't tell whether the girl in the picture was smiling at Rowan, at the storm, or at the woman she'd one day become. The mayor cleared his throat and raised a hand. "As is our way," he said, his voice low but steady. "We leave our lanterns here in honor of storms past and storms to come. Light for the sea, light for the sky, light for the hearts that weather both." One by one, people placed their lanterns in the sand or set them afloat on shallow pools. The paper spheres glowed like small suns, painting the cave walls with shifting warmth. The air seemed to shimmer with unspoken prayers, whispered wishes, the soft rustle of coats, the hush of rain just beyond the entrance. When it was their turn, Rowan held Mara's lantern steady as she set it on the shelf beside the heartstone. Its painted raindrops gleamed, magnified by the glow. Together, the 3 things — stone, photograph, lantern — looked less like relics and more like chapters of the same story. "What did you wish for?" Rowan asked quietly. Mara hesitated. "Something I don't know if I'm ready to name." "That's fair," he said. "Some wishes need rain to teach them their words." When the last lantern was placed, the cave dimmed into a gentle constellation, flickering against stone and sea alike. The town began its slow return, footsteps and voices blending into the sound of drizzle outside. But Mara and Rowan lingered. "You know," she said softly, "I told myself I'd only stay a week, just long enough to listen, to think, and now," she turned toward him, her face half shadowed, half glow from the lanterns. "Now I feel like the rain has more answers than I do." Rowan studied her expression, the way her eyes reflected the trembling lights. "Maybe answers aren't what we need," he said. "Maybe we just need to walk the path, lantern by lantern, even if we don't know where it ends." A wave crashed outside, thunder low and slow followed, and the cave seemed to hold its breath. Mara nodded slowly. "Then, let's keep walking." They stepped out into the storm's gentle hand, rain soft against their faces. The path back to town, gleaming like a ribbon of light strung with lanterns. Behind them, the cave glowed like a heart, still beating in the cliffside, patient and eternal. And above it all, The sky whispered down its endless letter, written line by line in rain. The morning after the lantern walk, the rain returned heavier, as if the sky had remembered its duty and come back with renewed resolve. It poured in sheets, rattling window panes, turning the cobblestones of Lantern Street into dark rivers that gleamed with shifting reflections. Mara woke to the sound of water hammering against the inn roof, a rhythm so insistent it felt like a question she could no longer avoid. On her bedside table lay two things: Mrs. Ellery's folded note reminding her of breakfast, and her phone with its glowing reminder about the meeting scheduled in 10 days, the one where she was supposed to accept the promotion. She turned the screen face down. The rain sounded louder when the world went dark. Downstairs, Mrs. Ellery was already pouring tea into thick ceramic mugs. "Heavy one today," she said, nodding toward the windows, where the storm blurred the street into an impressionist painting, the kind that makes people honest. Mara smiled faintly. "Honest. Can't hide much when the rain is this loud," Mrs. Ellery said, sliding a plate of toast toward her. "Conversations come out whether you plan them or not." By midday, Mara found herself at the weather station. The door creaked as she entered, and Rowan looked up from his logbook, pencil in hand. His hair was damp, his sleeves rolled, the smell of wet wool and paper filling the small room. "Storm's strong," she said. He nodded, flipping the page. "We're at 36 strikes since dawn. Pressure's dropping. She's not finished yet." She stepped closer, watching him tally neat lines in the book. "Do you ever get tired of it? Of storms?" He shook his head. "No, they change, but they never lie. You always know where you stand with rain." Mara hesitated, fingers brushing the edge of the desk. "I'm supposed to accept a promotion. 10 days. Bigger office, bigger city. It's everything I thought I wanted." Rowan set the pencil down carefully, as though the moment itself was fragile. And now, she said, voice low, "I don't know if I want any of it. I thought leaving meant moving forward, but here, I feel like I can breathe, like the rain has been waiting for me." He studied her for a long moment, the storm outside filling the silence. "Then, maybe the question isn't what you're supposed to want. Maybe it's whether the sound of rain feels more like silence or more like music." Mara laughed softly, almost bitterly. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Rowan said gently. "It's whether you don't control it. You just decide whether you can live inside it." That evening, the rain turned fierce. Waves crashed hard against the harbor wall, spray leaping high enough to soak the lantern poles left from the night before. Townsfolk hurried to reinforce sandbags, and Downpour Cafe stayed open late, steam rising in clouds from mugs of ginger tea. Mara and Rowan worked side by side at the grocer's corner again, their hands moving in the familiar rhythm, lift, set, pat. Each sandbag thudded into place like a heartbeat. When the wall was finished, Rowan leaned back, breath misting in the wet air. "You'll have to decide soon," he said, She looked at him, rain sliding down her face, lightning flashing behind him like a sketch of fire. I know. Just remember, he added, his voice nearly lost to the storm. Wherever you choose, city or here, it won't change the weather, only the company you keep inside it. Thunder rolled overhead, deep and endless, and Mara realized that no matter what she chose, the rain would follow her. The only question was whose footsteps would echo beside hers. By the next morning, Gloomhaven woke to chaos. The rain had not stopped. It had gathered strength through the night, driven inland by winds that howled against shutters and rattled loose tiles from rooftops. The river that cut through the center of town, usually a lazy gray ribbon lined with mossy stones, had swollen beyond its banks and was now roaring through Lantern Street like an uninvited guest. From her window at Mrs. Ellery's inn, Mara watched neighbors wade knee-deep through fast-moving water, carrying crates, lanterns, and stacks of books above their heads. Children were ferried in wooden barrels, squealing as they were pushed to higher ground. The street below smelled of wet earth, sea salt, and sharp, metallic ozone from the constant lightning. Mara grabbed her boots and coat. The time for thinking was over. At the weather station, Rowan was a blur of motion. Maps were spread across the table, radios crackling with updates from the harbor patrol. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his damp sweater clung to his shoulders. "You're late," he said, without looking up. "I came as fast as I could," Mara replied, pulling on gloves. "Tell me what to do." He pointed toward the lower bluff. "We need to secure the sea path before the tide takes it. If the path goes, the lighthouse road follows, and if the lighthouse road goes, the town floods," Mara finished for him. Rowan nodded grimly. Exactly. The storm met them head-on at the bluff. The wind tore at their coats, the rain striking sideways like needles. Lantern poles from last night's walk lay scattered in the mud, paper shells collapsing, glass beads shining like stars washed from the sky. The sea churned below, throwing spray high enough to sting their faces. They worked fast, hammering steel stakes into the shifting earth, securing tarps against rock slides, hauling heavy sandbags two at a time. The ground trembled with every distant thunderclap, and the cliffs moaned as water carved new veins through ancient stone. At one point, Mara slipped, sliding dangerously close to the edge before Rowan's hand caught hers. Their fingers locked, cold and slick, and for a moment neither of them moved, breaths harsh against the roar of the storm. "You okay?" he shouted over the wind. She nodded, gripping his arm tightly. "You can let go now." "Not yet," he said, refusing to release her until she was back on steady ground. By dusk, the worst of the flooding had reached the southern docks. They returned to Lantern Street, soaked and exhausted, only to find the town gathered in tense silence outside the grocer's. The corner had become a whirlpool where the river met the sea, dragging carts and crates into its spinning heart. "Harbor Patrol says we've got hours," maybe less, Nor called, her voice sharp with urgency, as she handed Rowan a steaming cup of tea. He didn't have time to drink. Mara looked at him, breathless from the climb, and saw something in his face she hadn't seen before, a flicker of fear beneath his practiced calm. "What if we lose it?" she asked quietly. "We won't," Rowan said, almost too quickly. "We can't." But the look in his eyes said otherwise. Night fell, but the storm didn't ease. The town worked under strings of lanterns salvaged from the walk, their fragile glow trembling in the wind. The rain soaked everything, clothes, sandbags, even the air itself, but nobody stopped. At one point, Mrs. Ellery appeared with an armful of quilts, forcing dry cloth into trembling hands, nor brewed kettles of ginger tea. Her cafe turned into a command post. Children slept huddled together in the upstairs rooms, while adults hauled, hammered, tied, and prayed. Mara found herself shoulder to shoulder with Rowan at the river's edge, tying ropes to the last of the lantern poles. The water surged violently below, and lightning lit the scene in stark flashes, faces pale, eyes determined, hands raw and muddy. "This storm," Rowan said between breaths, "isn't like the others. It's shifting the coastline. This isn't just rain anymore, it's rewriting us." Mara glanced at him, her hair plastered to her cheeks. "Maybe we needed rewriting." He looked at her for a beat, rain running down his jaw. "Some things don't need rewriting, Mara." By midnight, the tide began to retreat, leaving Lantern Street battered but standing. Water still ran in thin streams between the cobblestones, and the smell of salt and wet earth filled the air. But the town had held together, barely. Exhausted, Mara sat on the stone steps outside Downpour Cafe, hugging her knees as Rowan lowered himself beside her. The rain had softened again, back to its quiet hymn, and somewhere beyond the mist, thunder rolled like distant applause. She glanced sideways at him. "When the storm started, I thought it would make my choice clearer. And now," she shook her head, "now I don't know if I can leave this place, or you." Rowan didn't answer right away. He leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the rain cool his skin. Finally, he said softly, "Then stay until you do." Morning came gray and heavy, as if the storm had wrung the sky out and left it bruised. Rain still fell, steady but no longer furious, dripping from rooftops, sliding down gutters, trickling between cobblestones. The river had shrunk back into its bed, but it left behind wreckage, broken barrels, driftwood tangled with seaweed, lantern frames crushed into the mud. Mara walked Lantern Street slowly, her boots splashing in shallow pools. Neighbors were already at work, sweeping mud from doorways, stacking ruined crates, hanging blankets across windows to dry. The whole town smelled of damp wood, smoke, and the faint sweetness of Mrs. Ellery's storm cake baking in the inn's oven to keep spirits alive. At the corner, Rowan was knee-deep in mud, prying loose one of the lantern poles that had lodged itself into the stone. His sweater was torn at the sleeve, his hands raw from rope burns, yet he moved with the same steady rhythm, as though storms had always been his companions. "You should rest," Mara said, stepping closer. Rowan looked up, rain dripping from his lashes. "And let the town fix itself without me. Not likely." Later that day, when the worst of the cleanup had eased, Mara followed Rowan back to the weather station. The small building was warm, filled with the scent of wet wool and pencil shavings. He dropped heavily into a chair, stretching his sore hands before reaching for the logbook. "You're still writing?" Mara asked. "Always," Rowan said simply, sketching the nights lightening across the page. "If we don't record it, it's as if it never happened. And storms deserve to be remembered." She leaned against the wall, studying the neat rows of marks. "Is that why you stayed? To remember the storms?" Rowan paused, his pencil hovering above the paper. "Not just the storms," he said softly. Mara waited, sensing something more behind his words. Finally, Rowan closed the book and met her eyes. "There's something I never told you. The year you left, my father got sick. I couldn't follow you, even if I'd wanted to. I had to stay." Her breath caught. "Rowan, he asked me to look after the lighthouse," Rowan continued, voice steady though his hands trembled. "Said the storms would always need a keeper. And I thought you knew. I thought you understood why I couldn't write, why I couldn't explain. But when the letters stopped coming from you," he shook his head, rain still dripping faintly from his hair, "I figured silence was the choice you'd made." Mara pressed her palm against the cool stone wall, her throat tight. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought you'd let me go." "I never did," Rowan said, voice low, but certain. "The rain wouldn't let me." They stood there, the sound of drizzle filling the room like a third presence, not intrusive, but patient. Lightning flickered faintly in the distance, and thunder rolled like a memory just beyond reach. Mara stepped closer, her hand brushing the edge of his sleeve. "If I'd known, Rowan, I would have come back." "Maybe," he said. "But the truth is, we both had to weather our storms apart before we could meet here again." Her eyes stung, but she smiled through it, and now he exhaled slowly, as if the storm itself was leaving his chest. "Now we see if the forecast lets us begin again." That night, the town gathered in Downpour Cafe. Nor had lit every lantern she could find, and their glow turned the rain-streaked windows into sheets of gold. People laughed, shared food, mended what was broken. Children ran between tables with dripping boots, while elders leaned close, speaking softly about past floods, past storms. Mara sat across from Rowan, the hum of voices wrapping around them like a quilt. She realized then that Gloomhaven was more than rain. It was a chorus, a community bound by water and thunder and light. And Rowan, with his logbooks and his steady hands, was at its heart. Her phone buzzed faintly in her pocket. She didn't look at it. Not yet. The storm had carried too many truths to let one more interruption in. Instead, she lifted her mug, steam rising in curls, and whispered more to herself than to him. Maybe the rain is the only forecast I need. Rowan's smile was quiet, but certain. Then, let's keep walking through it. The following morning, the rain softened into a mist, falling so fine it clung to eyelashes like tiny pearls. Lantern Street looked washed clean, but the storm's scars remained: broken fences, splintered boards, a few windows patched hastily with cloth. Gloomhaven always survived its storms. Yet this time, something felt different, as though the town itself had exhaled and was waiting to see who stayed and who would leave. Mara stood at her window in Mrs. Ellery's inn, staring at the phone on the table. A single notification pulsed on the screen. Reminder: executive promotion meeting. 9 days. She picked up the phone, then set it down, picked it up again. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she finally pressed the power button, turning it off entirely. For the first time in months, silence filled her. And yet outside, the rain kept talking. Down at the harbor, Rowan was already working. His boots sank slightly into the mud as he helped repair the dock. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, hair damp and clinging to his forehead. Mara approached slowly, watching him tie ropes with hands so sure it was, as if the wind itself obeyed him. "You should take a break," she called, her voice low under the gulls' cries. Rowan looked up, wiping rain from his cheek with the back of his wrist. "And let someone else's knots fail. Not a chance." She smiled faintly and stepped closer. "You don't trust anyone else with the dock." "I trust them," he said, looping a rope neatly around a cleat. "But the sea doesn't. She's temperamental. Better to have old hands on her moods." Mara crouched beside him, running her fingers along the wet rope. "And what about me?" Rowan glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "You," he said softly, "have your own storms to tie down." That evening, the rain turned steady again, drumming softly on the roof of the weather station. Mara joined Rowan there, the warmth inside wrapping around her like a blanket. The kettle whistled quietly on the stove, while the logbooks lay open on the desk. One neat, one chaotic, both full of history. Rowan poured tea into 2 chipped mugs and slid one toward her. "You've been quiet all day." Mara held the mug between her hands, letting the steam curl into her face. "I've been thinking about the promotion," she nodded. "About everything, about the city, the office, the meetings that last longer than sunsets. About how I thought dry skies meant freedom. And now," Rowan asked gently. "And now," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "I feel like I've been thirsty for years, and I didn't even know it until I came back." Rowan studied her face for a moment, then set his mug down carefully. "You don't have to decide tonight." "I know," Mara whispered, tracing the chipped rim of the mug with her fingertip. "But it feels like I'm choosing between 2 versions of myself, the one I thought I wanted to be, and the one I found here." Rowan leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. "Maybe it's not about choosing who to be. Maybe it's about choosing where you can breathe." The storm outside deepened. Rain ran in silver threads down the station's windows, distorting the glow of lanterns on the street below. Lightning flickered distantly, soft and tired, followed by thunder that rolled like a drumbeat beneath the sea. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds the ticking of the kettle and the rain's patient song. Finally, Mara spoke, her voice no louder than a whisper. "If I stay, Rowan, does anything between us change?" Rowan didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the logbook, his hand resting on a pencil that he didn't move. When he finally looked up, his eyes were steady, quiet storms of their own. "It already has," he said simply. Later that night, Mara walked back to the inn alone. Lantern Street shimmered under the drizzle, every puddle reflecting pale light from the windows above. Somewhere nearby, someone was singing softly, their voice carried gently on the wet air. Mara stopped under the overhang of the bookshop, watching the rain pool at her feet. She thought of her office, the glass walls, the endless emails, the sound of HVAC instead of storms. Then she thought of this street, where even silence carried the heartbeat of the sea. In her chest, something shifted, quiet but certain, like the tide turning. And though the rain still fell, she realized she no longer felt cold. The next morning dawned restless. The rain was softer, yes, but the wind had picked up, tugging at shutters and whispering down chimneys like a messenger with urgent news. Lantern Street glistened, puddles trembling with each breath of air, as though the town itself waited for something unseen. Mara sat on the edge of her bed at Mrs. Ellery's inn, her phone in hand, staring at the darkened screen. She hadn't turned it on since the flood, pretending for days that her other life didn't exist. But today, she couldn't ignore it anymore. With a slow breath, she pressed the button. The screen blinked awake, and within seconds, the notifications flooded in like an incoming tide. Missed calls, emails, calendar reminders, and then the one she dreaded most. Final confirmation required. Executive promotion. Meeting moved to tomorrow at 10 o'clock a.m. Tomorrow. She exhaled shakily and set the phone down on the quilt, as though it were made of glass. The promotion was no longer a distant possibility. It was a wave already breaking. She found Rowan at the weather station, standing by the wide window that overlooked the harbor. The sky was a smear of gray, gulls cutting across it like crooked brush strokes. A kettle hissed softly in the corner, but neither of them reached for it. "You're pale," he said, without turning around. "The city called," she said simply. Rowan nodded once, as though he'd expected it. "Tomorrow." "Yes." The silence stretched between them, long and taut, broken only by the patter of rain against the windowpane. Finally, Rowan spoke, his voice quiet, almost careful. "You've been trying not to choose," he said. "But the storm doesn't wait forever." Mara leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. "And what would you have me do? Stay here and pretend I don't want the life I built? Do you?" Rowan turned then, meeting her gaze head on. His eyes were dark, storm gray in the soft light. "Do you still want it, Mara? Or are you chasing it because you're afraid to stop? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Rowan sighed and stepped closer, wiping rain from his hands onto his sweater. "There's something I haven't told you," he said finally, his voice low enough that the storm seemed to hush outside to hear him. Mara frowned, tension knotting in her chest. "What is it?" "The lighthouse," he said. "I'm being offered its stewardship, officially this time. It's more than the weather station. It's everything. Full maintenance, emergency response, the signal systems. I'd be tied to Gloamhaven for years." Mara stared at him, the weight of his words sinking like stones into water. "You've already decided." He shook his head slowly. "I haven't. But if I take it, I stay. Forever." Lightning flashed distantly, throwing his shadow against the far wall. Mara's breath caught as the thunder rolled in behind it, soft but deep, like a drumbeat buried beneath the earth. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered. "Because I didn't want you to think I was asking you to choose me over your life," Rowan said, his voice steady but rough. "This isn't about me. It's about whether you belong here or somewhere else." For a long moment, they stood there, surrounded by the hum of rain and the low creak of the old station walls. Mara's chest felt tight, as though every drop of water outside had pooled inside her instead, filling the spaces where words should be. She turned away from him, staring out the window where the harbor lay wrapped in mist. Lantern Street was alive below them. People moving between shops, carrying supplies, patching broken shutters. Life here went on, quietly but firmly, in rhythm with the rain. "This town breathes differently," she said softly, as though speaking to the glass itself. It makes you slow down enough to hear yourself." Rowan didn't answer, but his reflection in the window watched her closely. Still as stone, she closed her eyes and whispered, "I don't know how to leave it again." That night, Mara walked Lantern Street alone, the drizzle soft against her cheeks. Downpour Cafe glowed warmly behind fogged windows, and Nor waved from inside, holding up a mug in silent invitation. But Mara kept walking, past the bookshop with its damp chalkboard sign, past the grocer's corner, still dark from the flood, until she reached the edge of the harbor. The sea was restless, a dark mirror rippled with faint lightning far out beyond the horizon. She stood there for a long time, letting the wind tangle her hair, her thoughts running as wild as the tide. Behind her, footsteps approached softly over wet wood. Rowan stopped beside her, but didn't speak. They stood together in silence, two figures beneath 1,000 dripping lanterns. The entire world narrowed to the sound of waves and rain. Finally, Rowan said, his voice low and certain, "Whatever you decide, the rain will still fall, the sea will still rise, and I'll still be here." Mara turned to him, her eyes reflecting the harbor lights. "I don't know if I can walk away from this," she said. "From you?" "Then don't," he whispered. But the phone in her pocket buzzed again, its sharp vibration cutting through the soft hymn of rain. One choice, one day, one storm waiting to break. Tomorrow would decide everything. The morning of the decision came with an unusual silence. For the first time in weeks, Mara woke to the absence of rain. The room felt weightless, almost wrong, as though Gloamhaven itself had paused to listen. No soft tapping on the glass, no distant thunder rolling across the sea, only the quiet hum of the harbor beyond her window. It should have brought clarity. It didn't. Her phone lay on the bedside table, dark and still, like a stone she didn't dare lift. The promotion meeting was set for 10 o'clock a.m. The city waited, glass towers, reaching for a dry sky hundreds of miles away. Mara sat at the edge of the bed, twisting the silver ring on her finger, the weight of time pressing against her chest. Downstairs, Mrs. Ellery moved quietly around the kitchen, setting out bread, boiled eggs, and the first batch of storm cake. The windows were open, letting in damp air laced with salt. "You didn't sleep," she said without turning. Mara shook her head, sinking into the small chair by the window. Mrs. Ellery set a mug of tea in front of her and folded her hands, her voice low and steady. "I've watched people leave this town for 40 years, she said. "Some come back, some don't. The ones who stay never regret it, but neither do the ones who truly wanted to go." Mara stared into the rising steam. "What if I don't know which one I am?" Mrs. Ellery smiled softly. "Then wait until you do. But remember, dear, sometimes the rain makes the choice for you." At 9:30 a.m., Mara found herself climbing the lighthouse road, her phone cold and silent in her pocket. She didn't even remember deciding to come here. Her feet had carried her without permission, the path knowing her heart better than her thoughts did. The weather station door was open, and Rowan stood by the window, shoulders tense, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. The logbooks were closed for once, the pencil still. "You came," he said quietly, turning toward her. "I didn't know where else to go," Mara admitted, her voice rough. "You don't have to decide alone." She shook her head, pacing toward the window. The harbor stretched below them, fragile and luminous, the lantern poles still swaying faintly from last week's walk. "If I take the job," she whispered, "I move to a city where storms are just background noise. No rain-soaked streets, no tides, no." She stopped before finishing his name. "And if you stay?" Rowan asked. Mara turned to face him, heart pounding. "Then I give up everything I thought I wanted, everything I built." He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking like water pulled by gravity. "Mara," he said softly, "what if what you built was never what you needed?" Her phone buzzed in her pocket, sharp and insistent, breaking the fragile silence between them. She pulled it out, staring at the glowing screen. "Promotion meeting starting now. Join call." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The entire weight of her old life condensed into a single button: accept or decline. Rowan didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched her, waiting, his hands loose at his sides, but his eyes steady, as if he'd already decided for her, but would never take the choice away. Thunder rolled softly over the sea, though the sky above remained dry. Somewhere the weather shifted, holding its breath. Mara closed her eyes. Her heartbeat roared louder than the tide. And when she finally exhaled, her thumb pressed the screen. The call ended before it began. She set the phone down on the table between them, its black screen reflecting the two of them standing close. Too close, like the eye of a storm they'd both stepped into. "I stayed," she said simply. Rowan's shoulders loosened, his breath coming in sharp relief. But he didn't smile. Instead, he stepped nearer, rain-damp air still clinging to him, though the sky had not yet broken. "You're sure?" he asked. "No," she admitted, "but I've never been more certain." Outside, the first drops began to fall again, soft, deliberate, steady, as though the rain had been waiting for her answer all along. The sea whispered against the rocks. Lantern poles creaked gently in the breeze, and Gloomhaven exhaled, its rhythm resuming with the weather. Inside the station, neither of them spoke. The decision had been made, but the meaning of it hadn't yet settled. The rain tapped at the windows, writing the first lines of a new story they hadn't yet learned to read. The storm returned that night, as if it had been waiting just beyond the horizon for Mara's decision. The drizzle that had started in the afternoon thickened into long, silver threads that swayed in the wind, blurring the lights of Lantern Street and turning the harbor into a shifting mirror of pale gold and shadow. Inside the weather station, Rowan stood by the open window, the damp wind pushing against his shirt as he leaned on the sill. Mara sat at the desk, tracing the grooves in the wood with her fingertip, listening to the rain tick softly against the glass jars of barometric readings. "You didn't say anything after the call," Rowan said finally, his voice quiet beneath the storm's hum. "There wasn't much to say," Mara replied, her tone calm but heavy. "I stayed. The city, it's over." He turned to her slowly, his face unreadable in the lantern's glow. "It's not that simple." "No," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the logbook lying open between them. "It's not." The wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere far out at sea, thunder rolled like a slow drumbeat, muffled by distance. Rowan moved to the desk and leaned over the logbook, flipping to a blank page. He dipped the pencil in the faint pool of lamplight and began sketching without looking at her. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly. "The coast," he said. "This storm's changing it again. The southern bluffs lost more stone, and the river carved a new channel during the flood." She watched his hands, steady and sure despite the wind pressing at the windows. "You've spent your whole life keeping track of what the storms take away," she murmured. "And what they leave behind," he added, glancing at her briefly. "Both matter." For a while, neither of them spoke. The station creaked in the wind, and the rain hissed steadily on the roof, like paper burning slowly. Mara closed her eyes and let the sound fill her, her breathing falling into rhythm with it. "I used to think I hated the rain," she confessed suddenly. Rowan raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. In the city, it felt like an inconvenience, she continued. Gray skies meant canceled plans, wet shoes, clogged trains. But here, she opened her eyes, meeting his. Here it feels like the world is listening, like it's alive. Rowan smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth softening. That's because it is, he said simply. Gloomhaven breathes with the storms. The rain writes its history. Every drop knows where it belongs. Mara studied him in silence for a moment, her chest tightening with something unspoken. And where do you belong, Rowan? She asked finally, her voice barely louder than the rain. He hesitated, setting the pencil down. The answer hung between them, heavy, charged like the air before lightning. I thought I knew, he admitted quietly. I thought my place was here at the station, the lighthouse, keeping watch over storms that don't need me, but somehow let me stay anyway. He paused, searching her face. But lately, I'm not sure if I'm here because it's where I belong, or because I was afraid to leave. Mara's heart stuttered, her breath catching in her throat. You, she whispered. Afraid, he laughed softly, shaking his head. Everyone thinks the storms make you fearless, but they don't. They just teach you how small you are. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the water, its pale circle touching the rain like a pulse. The station filled with that moving light for a brief moment before sinking back into shadow. I don't know what this means, Mara said after a while, her voice unsteady. You, me, the station, staying, choosing this town over. She broke off, pressing her hands to her face. Rowan reached across the desk and touched her wrist lightly, hesitant at first, then steady when she didn't pull away. Then don't name it yet, he said softly. Some storms don't need forecasts. They just need time. She lowered her hands slowly, looking at him through the soft gold light. And what if I'm wrong? What if I've given up everything for something that doesn't last? Rowan's thumb brushed faintly against her wrist, a quiet anchor. Then we rebuild, he said simply. That's what we do here. The rain takes, the rain gives, and we stay anyway. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of thunder breathing far off, of waves folding into the rocks, of two heartbeats barely out of sync. When Mara finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. I'm scared, Rowan. He leaned closer, the shadows soft against his jaw, the lamplight glinting faintly in his eyes. So am I, he admitted, but I'd rather be scared here with you than certain anywhere else. Outside, the storm broke suddenly, lightning flashing bright enough to light the entire harbor in silver. For a heartbeat, it looked like the sea and sky had become one. Inside the station, Mara reached across the table and took his hand. Neither of them moved after that. They didn't need to. The rain wrote the rest of the chapter for them. One steady drop at a time. The storm did not end that night. It carried on into the morning, into the next day, as if determined to test the town one last time. But Gloomhaven did not bend. Lantern Street carried its puddles like jewels. Children laughed as they splashed, and the smell of wet pine and salt clung to every breath. At the edge of the bluff, the lighthouse stood tall, its beams sweeping across the rain in patient arcs. Mara and Rowan climbed the narrow spiral staircase together, their steps echoing softly against stone slick with damp. At the top, the lantern glass fogged with mist. The world beyond was blurred, harbor, sea, horizon, all swallowed by gray. Mara pressed her hand to the window, tracing the path of a raindrop as it slid down. "It feels endless," she whispered. "It is," Rowan said. He stood beside her, his hand brushing hers on the cold glass. "Storms don't stop, they just change shape." For a long while they stood in silence, the rain surrounding them like a living thing. Finally, Rowan drew a breath, his voice low but steady. "They offered me stewardship of the lighthouse," he said. "I told you before, but I didn't tell you my answer." Mara turned to him, her heart quickening. And he looked out over the harbor, where the town's rooftops glistened like wet shells. "I'm taking it, not because I'm trapped here, not because I'm afraid to leave, but because I finally understand something." "What?" she asked softly. "That this isn't just a place I keep watch over. It's home, and I don't want to belong anywhere else." Lightning flickered far out at sea, illuminating the steady beam of the lighthouse. Rowan's eyes found hers. "But Mara, I don't want to keep it alone." The words hung between them, heavier than thunder, lighter than rain. Mara's breath caught, her chest tight with all the choices she'd been running from. The city, the promotion, the glass towers, the endless schedules. They felt like someone else's life now. She reached for his hand slowly, her fingers threading with his. "I stayed," she whispered. "Not because I was brave, not because I was ready, but because when the storm came, this is where I wanted to be." Rowan squeezed her hand, his voice breaking just slightly. "Then stay again. Tomorrow, and the day after. Stay until the rain forgets us, which it never will." They kissed then, the way storms break, sudden, inevitable, charged with years of waiting. The rain rattled the glass around them. Thunder rolled deep and patient. And for a moment, it felt as though the whole world had leaned closer to listen. When they pulled apart, Mara laughed quietly, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. "The forecast doesn't matter anymore, does it?" Rowan smiled, resting his forehead against hers. "No," he murmured, "the only forecast that matters is us." That evening, Gloamhaven gathered once more in the harbor square. Lanterns lit the wet street, their glow trembling in puddles, casting gold halos on every face. The storm had gentled into drizzle, as if even the rain respected the moment. Mara and Rowan stood together beneath a single umbrella, their shoulders touching. The lighthouse beams swept over them, over the town, over the sea, a promise in light, repeated again and again. And as the rain fell, steady, eternal, alive, Mara finally understood. Home wasn't dry skies or city lights. Home was here, in the storm, with him. The rain would never stop, and neither would they.